And welcome to Serpente Sunday for Sunday, January 10th, 2021. Today's presentation is going to be on force versus choice-based care and recognizing exactly what that looks like. We're going to start with the following premises, and I don't mean locations. I mean a premise as in ideas that we are starting with and agreeing on right off the bat as we further this discussion. So for this presentation discussion, animals are in captivity with no possibility of being set free. So when we talk about choice versus force, see that I have captivity circled here because right off the bat, we're using force. The animals in our care were not asked if they wanted to be under captive management or not. We didn't go out into their native habitats and ask them, hey, do you want to come into civilization and live with me in my house and be in a cage? So we are already using some degree of force or coercion just by the fact that we have these animals under human care in captivity. So we are starting with this premise that for this following discussion, these animals are already under captive management. None of them have any possibility of being set free, and they are never going to be presented with that choice. And so given those circumstances and given that starting point, the next premise that we are going to base this presentation on is that as caretakers of these animals, we are dedicated to progressing their care and improving their welfare in the best possible ways that we can under captive management. You need to know that I hold certifications as an animal trainer that require me to adhere to LIMA principles. And I obtained these specific certifications because I agree with LIMA principles. And LIMA stands for least intrusive, minimally aversive. And that means that whatever we do as far as regular care and husbandry, veterinary care, training, anytime we're interacting with these animals, we should be striving to use the least intrusive, minimally aversive techniques, methods possible when we work with each individual. And you also need to be aware that current welfare science supports the use of the least intrusive, most effective methods to provide care, and that's any kind of care. And we will talk a little bit more about what least intrusive, most effective means, as opposed to least intrusive, minimally aversive. They're very much related, but not quite exactly the same thing. So these are the premises that we are starting this presentation based on as we move forward. Now let's talk about these two words, force versus choice. And are they really versus each other? Or are we always subjected to certain degrees of each of these things? And are our animals subjected to certain degrees between force and choice? I think the answer is yes, because we live in a society that puts certain boundaries and constraints on us as human beings. And I've already mentioned that these animals we're talking about are in captivity. That wasn't by choice, so we're already imposing some degree of force and coercion on them just by keeping them under captive management in the first place. And so force versus choice is really a continuum. And if you look at the bottom of this page, on the far left of this continuum, you have complete subjugation, heavy-handed treatment. Basically, all decisions are made for you. You're told what to do, and you have no control over your own life. And then at the far right of the continuum, you have total freedom, no boundaries, no constraints. You're free to do whatever you want, whenever you want, with absolutely no boundaries whatsoever. We don't live like that as humans, and our animals certainly don't live like that. So force-based care versus choice-based care is certainly on a continuum of complete subjugation to complete freedom. And most things fall somewhere in between. And we really want things to fall closer to the side of freedom. However, because we're managing these animals in captivity, it can't always be that way. And so on the far left, again, you've got complete subjugation, then we've got some coercion, and then in the middle, you've got the least intrusive, most effective principle. And we're going to talk more about that. And then you've got cooperative behaviors, which is what we strive to do here as much as we possibly can when it comes to our care and management of the animals. And then again, on the far right of the spectrum, you've got complete and total freedom with no boundaries or constraints. So let's look at the words force and choice and what came to my mind when I thought of these words and what I found in the various dictionaries that I used as sources. Force, compulsion, pressure, duress, intimidation, something that's obligatory or completely involuntary. You are being forced to do something against your will, or you're forcing another to do something against their will. Coercion, subordination, constraint, and restraint. Again, it's something that's against your will or against the will of another, and it can involve violence. And then choice is the power to select. It's freedom and independence and autonomy and the ability to make your own decisions. It's an endless stream of possibilities that you have to choose from. It's you doing things willingly, voluntarily. You have preferences. You can express your preferences, and you have endless opportunities. So again, force versus choice-based care isn't black and white. We want to strive for the most choice-based care that we can, because welfare science informs us that that is what makes our lives better and us happier, more content humans, and it is no different for animals. Welfare science also tells us the same thing for animals. That's all animals, whether it's a dog, cat, guinea pig, or your snake. So control, who has it and who should have it? Now remember, we are talking about animals that are under human care. They're under captive management with no possibility of being set free into the wild. And it's always been my philosophy to allow animals to be partners in their own care, but we have to be the senior partner because we are the ones managing these animals. It's our fault that they're in captivity in the first place. We made the decision to bring these animals into our lives and under human care, and it's our responsibility to make sure that they are taken care of to the best of our ability. And in order to do that, we have to be the senior partner, and we have to make decisions for them that keep them safe and keep them well. So again, allow animals to be partners in their own care, but be the senior partner. Let's read these bullet points. Force and choice come down to who has control, the individual doing the behavior or somebody else. Welfare science informs us that the more choice and control we give animals under captive management, the better their overall welfare. And this is not debatable at this point. I said at the beginning of this presentation that I'm giving this lecture today, Sunday, January 10th, 2021, and this is not debatable in today's day and age. There are numerous research studies and published peer-reviewed journal articles that support this. They've been out there for a number of years. There's recent ones that have just come out in the last couple of years. This research has been done on various types of animal species, and there is no debate at this point that what welfare science says is that animals under captive management have better overall welfare the more choice and control we can give them in their own lives. To ensure the safety and health of animals in our care, as well as our own, we must balance between the amount of freedom possible for the animal and the amount of control we must exert. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. Now, I mentioned research studies that welfare science has published in various different journals and through various different media. I'm going to list some of those resources at the end of this presentation because, as always, I wouldn't say something if it wasn't well supported by facts and empirical evidence. Before we discuss some specific examples, this is something that I wrote up, and I either posted it in one of my blogs or on social media, but it was on forced versus choice-based interactions. And I'm just going to read this to you because you completely need to keep this in the forefront of your mind as we move forward with our discussion today. Coercion means to use force or threats to demand obedience or to make another do something involuntarily. You are being coercive when you force another to do something against their will without concern for what they're experiencing. This generally causes the person or other animal to feel helpless and experience fear, anxiety, and distress. Another good word here would be hopeless. When somebody is subjected to force and coercion, it can feel like a pretty hopeless situation. When working with snakes and other animals, it's important to recognize that choice-based interactions, what choice-based interactions look like versus force-based interactions. The examples that I'm going to give you are very snake-centric because there's a lack of this information in the reptile world as a whole, but definitely among snake keepers. While there's a lot of this information available for mammals like horses, dogs, and even some exotic mammals, I wanted to give examples that were related directly to snakes because there's a huge hole in the animal training community and the animal behavior community when it comes to snake species. I want you to realize, though, that these general concepts apply to all animals, including humans. Cooperative care, along with the use of the least intrusive, most effective methods, leads to safer interactions with and improved welfare of animals under captive management. Again, that is not debatable. There is too much data out there to even say that this isn't true or to debate this anymore. There's lots and lots of studies out there. There's lots and lots of practical applications, and improved welfare has everything to do with using the least intrusive, most effective methods and giving the subject of the care as much choice and control as possible. You do need to keep in mind, though, that individual animals, individual handlers, and the individual circumstances are going to dictate what the least intrusive, most effective methods are for any given situation. So, for example, if my snake is already target trained to shift out of their enclosure upon presentation of the target and station on a scale, that's very minimally intrusive. It's not intrusive at all. I've showed them a target and they have chosen to voluntarily exit their enclosure and station on a scale. So for that individual snake, that is the least intrusive, most effective method. However, if a snake has not been trained to do that, and for some reason it's just critical that we get their weight, then the least intrusive, most effective method to weigh an animal that isn't used to handling, that isn't target trained, that isn't shift trained is going to look much different than what I just described. It may look like waiting until they're in a hide and lifting the whole hide out and weighing it. It may look like reaching in and grabbing the snake out and forcing them to sit on a scale, or putting them in a bag or a bin and putting that on the scale. So the individual animal, the individual handler, and the individual circumstances are going to dictate what at that moment is the least intrusive, most effective method to handle that situation. All right, let's talk about force-based care in general and choice-based care in general and what these actually look like in regard to snakes. So if you are the type of keeper or handler that generally leans towards force-based care, it's going to look like things like this: removing the snake from hiding, intruding into the habitat and searching for the snake, picking up the snake and moving it. If you're trying to train the snake, it may look like placing the target into the snake's personal space when it has not been previously trained to accept this as something that's a cue or a signal, or as something that is pleasant or positive or is going to result in consequences that they like. In other words, you're just taking something and shoving it in the snake's face that they've never seen before. Can be quite frightening. If the snake is prevented from escape or retreat opportunities, that is absolutely force-based. So if you are preventing your snake from getting away, that is coercion, that is force. The snake is awakened or disturbed while resting or sleeping. If the caretaker approaches the snake and then ignores body language indicating moderate to severe stress. So you're trying to interact with the animal in some way, its body language is clearly telling you, I am stressed, I'm scared, get away from me, and you completely ignore that and you do what you want anyway, that's force. Cornering a snake to pick it up or take it out of its habitat, picking up the snake to put it back into its habitat, grabbing a balled up snake out of its safe space. This one's really important because a lot of people have royal pythons as family pets, Python Regis. We have 2 of them here that we work with, and one of their stress and fear signals, one of the things they do as far as body language to indicate that they are stressed is to ball up. It's a defensive reaction. And people ignore that all the time, and they interact with the snake anyway. So that would be equivalent to me telling you to leave me alone, get away from me, don't come any closer, or even physically fighting back as you're coming towards me, and you ignore all of that and you come and pick me up anyway. That is basically what a Python Regis is doing when it's all balled up and it's hiding its head. It's telling you, leave me alone, I'm afraid, I'm not comfortable with this, and people totally ignore that and pick the snake up anyway. Prodding the snake to get it to move, or forcibly controlling where it goes. That is obviously coercion and force-based. And then flooding. Flooding is one of the most force-based, other than physical violence, things that you can do to an animal or another person. And I'm going to talk more about that on the next slide. Here are what choice-based interactions look like. So again, picture these in your mind. All those things we just went over is what it looks like if somebody uses force-based methods to interact with their snake on a regular basis, if somebody leans more on that side of the spectrum than the choice-based side. So if you're more of a choice-based keeper, things may look like this. The snake emerges from hiding on their own. The snake is visible within the habitat while you are present. The snake relocates on its own. That means it moves out of hiding to a perch or a shelf, or it moves from one side of the enclosure to the other, or from inside of the enclosure out of the enclosure, or it moves from out of the enclosure back in. It's moving around, relocating on its own voluntarily. A target is presented at a distance and the snake approaches to investigate. So the snake chooses to engage with the activity by following the target or interacting with the target in some way, whether that's to come out of hiding, to come out of their enclosure, to move from an exercise space to a scale, to station on an exam table. They're following the target and they're doing that willingly. The snake can move away without interference. This is hugely important if you want to be more on the side of choice-based handling. The snake needs to have the ability to move around on its own without you interfering. Unless, of course, there's a safety reason that you need to redirect the snake. We will talk about that. But you're not interfering with the snake when it's trying to flee or get away or hide. Remember that those are things the snake does because it's fearful or uncomfortable or feeling threatened, and it does those things to feel safe. And when you don't allow the snakes to do that, you are definitely causing them to be distressed, and that can contribute to poor welfare. Interaction with the snake is initiated when it's awake, alert, and active on its own. The caretaker allows the snake to approach them, training the snake to voluntarily exit or go into a shift box, teaching the snake to return to the enclosure on cue, training the snake to come out on its own, teaching the snake to orient towards a target or to a station or to something else in order to help guide it where to go. And then gradual desensitization or counter conditioning versus flooding. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. Remember the least intrusive, most effective methods. If you always think least intrusive, most effective, what is the least intrusive I can be in order to still accomplish this care? That's the way that you want to start thinking. Just real quickly, I want to mention that counter conditioning is when you condition an animal from being afraid or worried about something to seeing that same stimulus as something that is pleasurable. And a really good example I'll give you is with one of our dogs, Astro. He's one of our smooth collies. He was afraid of loud noises like power tools or the blender or the vacuum cleaner or anything like that that was motorized that we would turn on in the house. And he would just run from it and flee. He would bark at it and just go berserk. And so then I started feeding him extra special treats that he loves every time the blender would get turned on or the vacuum would get turned on or a power tool would get turned on. And now when he hears those things, he runs to where that's happening and he sits in front of me and he waits for treats. So instead of now being afraid of those things, he sees those things as something very, very good and positive. And that's called counter conditioning. And that is different from flooding. And it's also different from gradual desensitization, which we're going to talk about next. But counter conditioning, you always want to start with the animal far, far away from the aversive stimulus, and then start making it more and more pleasurable for them to hear the aversive stimulus or see the aversive stimulus. And you get the animal slowly closer and closer to what they initially felt was aversive, until they can be basically right on top of it and as happy as can be, because now they associate it with something they like, which could be food or it could be something else. But food's a primary reinforcer, and so we use that most of the time. An important distinction for everybody to realize is the difference between flooding and gradual desensitization. So when you flood an animal, and this includes people, flooding isn't new to the animal world. Flooding isn't something that just came up amongst animal trainers or animal behaviorists. Flooding is something that's been used in human psychology and human psychiatry for many, many years, but it's been shown to be ultimately not the best way to change behavior. It can be very, very intrusive and aversive and have some detrimental side effects to both people and animals. So flooding is when the animal is continuously exposed to an aversive stimulus with no possibility of escape. So this is, you're deathly afraid of spiders. You have a true, actual diagnosed phobia of spiders. You can't even look at a picture of one. But I put you into a room filled with spiders and I lock you in there and I don't let you out. And you have no possibility of escape and you're literally flooded with spiders. That is what flooding is. So whatever that animal sees as an aversive stimulus, whether it's you, whether it's a noise, whether it's something that's being done to them, you continue to do that to them with no possibility of them escaping. And I see people do this all the time with snake handling. They handle the snake, handle the snake, handle the snake. The snake is trying to escape and avoid and get away, and you are preventing that from happening, and you're just flooding the snake with your handling and your presence. So the animal's forced to endure the aversive stimulus until it becomes so tired that it just gives up or it enters a state of learned helplessness. So basically, it's tried escape and avoidance, and it's realized that no matter what it does, there is no possibility that it's going to be able to get away, and it's unable to cope with that aversive stimulus in any kind of healthy way, and it just shuts down. It just becomes so tired and exhausted that it goes limp, it gives up, or it enters a state of learned helplessness, which is it's just in condition black. Its brain is frozen or panicked to the point where it can't think, it can't learn. It's totally shut off from reality, and it's just completely shut down. And I know many keepers mistake learned helplessness and fatigue for, oh, the snake's used to it now. It's okay with it now. I just held it until it quit struggling, and now he's okay with it. No, now the animal is probably in a state of learned helplessness or so tired that it's unable to struggle anymore, and it hates you, or the equivalent. It's going to find you as an aversive stimulus. It's going to associate you with unpleasantness, and that is not something that you want between you and an animal in your care. You want to have a good relationship and good associations, pleasant associations between you and the animal that's in your care. So instead of building trust and pleasant associations with the stimulus and the handler, the animal becomes distrustful, fearful, and forms an unpleasant association with the handler or keeper or whoever it is that's doing the care. That is what flooding is. And it can absolutely lead to increased reactivity and aggression down the road. It may seem like the animal is okay for a while, but behaviors usually pop up later that can include increased aggression and increased fear and reactivity, to include worse bites or whatever the behavior is that animal's normal defense mechanism. This is not debatable. There is study after study in not only human psychology, but in animal behavior science that says that this happens. It ends up that if you flood the animal, you're going to have consequences to deal with down the road. And this is not something that is supported by any reputable organization that certifies animal behaviorists or animal trainers. And again, I will list resources at the end of the presentation, but flooding is something that we should not be doing to people or animals because it has detrimental consequences to the welfare of that individual. Now let's look on the other side at gradual desensitization. And this is where the handler allows the animal to approach and retreat while habituating them to aversive stimuli in their own time. So if I'm trying to get a snake used to handling, I might handle it for a few seconds and it starts to try to get away and I let it get away. And then the next time I handle it, maybe I'm able to handle it for, instead of 5 seconds, 10 seconds before it starts to try to get away, and then I let it get away. So the handling is done a few seconds at a time, working your way up to longer and longer, but always allowing the animal the choice to leave. And just having that freedom to move away makes the handling training go a lot quicker, because if the animal knows that it doesn't have to stay there, that it's able to get away, then it can focus more on you and investigating you and learning that you're not something that's bad or aversive and that it's not too bad to let you touch it. And there's a whole bunch of ways that you can desensitize snakes to handling. I'll have to do that in another presentation, but just understand that the huge difference here is that anything that you're subjecting the snake to, they have the ability to get away from. And that is how you gradually desensitize them to things, not by flooding them. Dr. Susan Friedman, who is somebody that I have studied with through Behavior Works, she does 2 8-week courses a year called Living and Learning with Animals. And I went through that 1 or 2 years ago, but she specializes in not only animal behavior, but also in, I think, child behavior issues. But she refers to gradual desensitization as systematic desensitization. And this is a quote from her course. It's a procedure in which a conditioned emotional response, something like fear of a harmless stimulus, is extinguished by gradually exposing the animal to the fear eliciting stimulus. So let's just break that down, because this is super important, especially for snake keepers, to understand how different this is from flooding. So a conditioned emotional response just means the animal has been conditioned for whatever reason or is innately afraid of something to start with. So you as a human being, they're afraid of. So let's say that they have this conditioned emotional response of feeling fear when they see a human. So let's say a human is the harmless stimulus, and we want to teach the snake that you don't have to be afraid of me. I'm harmless, okay? So that fear response is extinguished by gradually exposing the animal to the human, which first elicited fear, but now it doesn't, because you've gradually exposed the animal to the person. And you can do that through passive or active habituation, which I've talked about in other videos. You can do it through training, and you can do it through short handling sessions. But during gradual desensitization, the animal is free to move away from the aversive stimulus. And I have a star next to that because it is so important to understand if you are flooding an animal by exposing them with something they're afraid of or to something they're afraid of, and they have no ability to get away from it, that is flooding. And that's much, much different than gradually exposing the animal for short periods to something that they have been afraid of, but allowing them to move away when they choose. That's the difference between gradual desensitization and flooding. Please contact me if you have any questions about this, because it's super important in the snake keeping world to understand this, because I see way too much flooding. Well, I see flooding and I shouldn't see flooding at all. The only time I should see flooding if it's a medical emergency or something that has to be done to preserve the life and health of the animal, and the animal hasn't been trained to accept those things otherwise. All right, this is the behavior chart that I have shown so many times, and the behaviors on this chart came from a number of sources. It came from the latest issue of the Mater's Reptile and Amphibian Surgery medical book. It's basically the Bible for veterinarians that treat reptiles and amphibians. So the latest edition has a section on behavior and also has a section on training. So some of these came from that. Some of these came from Reptelligence. They have a blog about snake body language. Some of these came from my own experience, and some of these came from a couple of different published peer-reviewed research papers. Again, this is on my website, and all of the sources that I got these behaviors from are listed right there on the homepage of my website. And then I will list additional sources at the end of this presentation. But if you are engaging your animal in gradual desensitization, you are going to see your animal in the green and yellow zone. So your animal's in the green zone until they're presented with the aversive stimulus, and then they're going to enter the yellow zone, and they're going to start exhibiting some moderate stress. And they're going to show you some body language that indicates, hey, I'm not okay with this, I am stressed. And if they are allowed to leave, or if you take the aversive stimulus away, you should see them go back into this green zone where they're relaxed and comfortable. And so you are basically flipping back and forth between the green and yellow zone, between relaxed and comfortable and moderate stress, as you do gradual desensitization with your animal. Over here, where I've got flooding listed, flooding, the animal is going to be flipping between the yellow and red zone. And the red zone is somewhere where we never want the animal. The red zone is severe stress. So you present the animal with a stimuli that they see as aversive, and they start to exhibit moderate stress. They start to exhibit some of these behaviors in the yellow zone. But instead of allowing them to get away from the aversive stimulus, or instead of taking that aversive stimulus away, you continue to subject them to it, and then they flip over into the red zone, where they are completely overstimulated, they're severely stressed, they can't think, they can't learn, they're just out of their mind, panicked, or they shut down. And this is not a condition that we want our animals in, ever. So again, gradual desensitization, you'll see your snake flipping between green and yellow zone behaviors, and flooding, you're going to see them just tip over to the breaking point where they're in this red zone. And why would we want to do that to another living thing? I don't understand why you would want to push another living being into that state. Now I'm going to present some photo and video examples. Basically, the photo examples are right here, you're looking at them, and then I'm going to have some separate video examples. I will warn you that I have very few examples of force-based treatment or force-based keeping, force-based handling, because we seldom do that here. The only time that we do that here is, again, if it's a medical thing and we absolutely have to get a medical treatment done and the animal isn't open to voluntarily allowing us to do that treatment. And so I do have a couple of videos of things like that. But ideally, we want the animal to allow us to do even medical treatments, and some of our animals will. Some of our animals are trained to the point where they will voluntarily station for things like injections, etc., but not all of them. So again, when we talk about the least intrusive, most effective method, if the animal's trained to voluntarily shift out of their enclosure and station on an exam table, or station in a position and hold in position for a number of seconds where we can touch them and give an injection, that's great. If the snake's not there, if the snake hasn't learned that, or isn't to the point where they accept that and they have to have that injection, then we have to lean more towards that force-based keeping, and that's unfortunate. But we have to do what's necessary when it comes to the animal's health. So you're not going to see very many aversive or forceful examples in my videos. You're going to see mostly cooperative care behaviors, because that's what we strive for here. But in this photo in the upper left, this is just a photo example of transferring an animal from a quarantine tub to a regular habitat. This was a baby West Papuan carpet python. He was living in that quarantine tub. I made it identical to how the breeder described the one that he was raised in. And he lived in that for a short time. And then I was ready to move him into a regular enclosure. And so I just cut a hole in the top of his quarantine tub, and I put the whole thing fully furnished inside a larger habitat. I felt like that was the least intrusive way that I could smoothly transition him. And and cause the least stress on him, was just put his habitat in a larger habitat and allow him an egress and ingress to go in and out of the quarantine tub he was used to. And so thereby he could come in and out of that tub when he wanted, in his own time, and habituate to that larger space. In the lower left, you see one of our inland carpet pythons. That's Vagum Bray, and he has voluntarily shifted out of his enclosure upon presentation of a target, and he voluntarily stationed on that scale for weighing, and I was able to get a weight on him. Completely cooperative in his own care there, completely a voluntary behavior. He voluntarily cooperated to participate in his own weighing. And then on the top right, you see a snake. Now, this is not my picture because we do have these tubes here for emergencies, but I've never actually had to use one because I find that the snakes get more distressed when they are confined in a tube like this than when things are done another way. So this was a photo that I got from a Google search of a veterinarian doing radiographs on a snake. And so the snake was put in this tube to get x-rays. And then on the lower right is my coastal carpet python, Hank, who was getting x-rays. And as you see here, he's not restrained. And the way that we accomplished this is we allowed him to move around on that table for a few minutes and habituate to it, get comfortable on it. And then we just let him move next to that book. And then I asked him to hold in position with my hand. And he stayed still for the number of seconds that we needed to get radiographs. So we used very, very minimal restraint. We didn't even use restraint. We just used redirection and hand placement to keep him from moving when we needed him to be still. And he was very comfortable and relaxed with that, and we didn't have any problems getting the radiographs. This is a list of some of the resources that I talked about, and I'll also put this list on the YouTube description. But I encourage you to not just take my word for things. All of these things I talked about are very well documented as either aversive practices or best practices, depending on if we're talking about the force-based care or the choice-based care. And the things that I talked about regarding flooding versus giving individuals as much choice and control as possible are also very well documented. And these are excellent places to start. But you can do a Google Scholar search on any of these things I talked about and find best practices and find current peer-reviewed research that supports the things that I mentioned.
Thank you so much for sticking with me through that lecture. I know that it was kind of long, but it was really important information. And if you're truly dedicated to snake keeping in a choice-based way, that was important information for you to know. Feel free to watch it until you think that you have that solidified in your mind, and don't hesitate to ask me questions about it. I also encourage you to look up all of those resources that I mentioned and look up additional resources, because the resources I listed are going to lead you to even more resources that are out there. Now we're going to see a series of videos that are examples of mostly cooperative care behaviors, but I have a couple of examples in here that would be more on that force-based end of the care spectrum, unfortunately, because we have a couple of animals that have had to be treated for illnesses. So if you have any questions about any of these videos you're about to watch, again, just reach out to me. I'm very accessible through social media, email, or our website. This is one of our corn snakes who's voluntarily exiting his enclosure. And I'm gently guiding him a little bit. I did not want him going underneath the table. And so I just moved my hand to guide him in a different direction, which is a little bit coercive. And then he started to go in another location, which is off limits. And so I increased my force a little bit and guided him away from that area I don't want him to be in. And here he started to come out again. I offered him my hand. He didn't want to climb on that. But instead of going around the enclosure, he chose to go back inside. This is one of our Morelia Bradley Gaheris who has voluntarily exited his enclosure upon presentation of a target, and he is following it to station on a scale to be weighed. Now, this is not an actual weighing. This is just an exercise for him. It's actually the first time he's ever done this exercise, and it's actually the first time that he's ever completely targeted out of his enclosure. So I was very proud of him, but this is just an example of a voluntary behavior. This is a cooperative care behavior, and he is free to go back into his enclosure. He was actually free not to even come out in the first place, but he chose to come out. This is Tanavic. Again, I offered him an opportunity to come out of his enclosure by opening the door and presenting him with the target. And he chose to come out of that very dark hole that you see in the back left of his enclosure, all the way across to this side of his enclosure. He climbed up on that ledge to get in a better position to come out onto the station, and he chose to exit his enclosure when I asked. This is a completely voluntary behavior on his part. Again, he didn't have to come out, and at any point he could go back in, which he is choosing to do here. He came out for a little while, and then he voluntarily put himself back into his enclosure without any interference from me whatsoever. This is Gaharis, who spent quite a bit of time on the scale station, and I was fine with that because he's learning about it for the first time. But then he started to climb up on top of his enclosure. It's an area that I don't want him to be at this point, so I gently redirected him down here towards his enclosure front. Now, I'm not forcing him back in his enclosure. I'm giving him an opportunity to go someplace else. I redirected him from where he's not allowed to be, and he could choose now to go back in his enclosure, remain on the scale station, or he could climb up and down that activity stand that he's on. You've seen it in other videos if you watch our channel, and it's 4 levels, and it has different activities at each level. And so I did use some coercion here. I did use some force here because he started to climb into an area that just was not safe for him to be in. I had to be the senior partner and redirect his locomotion. I redirected him away from an area that just wasn't safe for him to an area that was safe for him. And he has choices here. Again, I'm not forcing him back into his enclosure. I'm just keeping him from a specific area, and he is choosing what he wants to do right now, basically, and he does ultimately choose to go back into his enclosure. But as I said before, he could have climbed up and down the activity tree. He could have stayed on the scale station. There's a bin next to his enclosure that would have been safe for him to climb on. It's another activity station, but he chooses to voluntarily put himself away. Given the choices of going anywhere else except on top of his enclosure, he chose to go back into his habitat. This is Vegan Bray. He is one of our inland carpet pythons, and I opened the door and I'm asking him if he will voluntarily shift out of his enclosure, which he does. I actually do want to weigh him, and so I'm asking him to voluntarily shift out of his enclosure and then station on the scale. This is a really fun note. He has never actually stationed on this scale before. I've never weighed him in this manner before. But even though he's never seen the scale station before, it was really no big deal for him to do this activity because he's very good at generalizing the targeting behavior to station on almost anything. He's very good at voluntarily coming out of his enclosure and stationing basically on anything that I present in front of him. This is his roommate. Her name is Costiana, and I'm not asking her to do anything other than just come out of her enclosure. And that was really just for this video so that you could see yet another piece of cooperative care and a voluntary behavior that the snakes are very willing to do when they know that they don't have to. She didn't have to come out. She didn't have to put her body on this table. She didn't have to do any of that. I wasn't forcing her. This is another inland carpet python. Her name is Sahal, and she lives in the enclosure above Costiana and Vegan Bray. And she is being asked if she will shift out of her enclosure and come to rest on top of this temporary tub that's next to her enclosure. Again, she doesn't have to. She could have stayed in her enclosure. She could have gone into hiding. Nothing is forcing her to do this behavior. And after she did the behavior, she voluntarily turned around and put herself away. I didn't have to force that either. Now, this is an example of what force looks like. This is Vegan Bray demonstrating what it looks like to be picked up, moved to a location, and placed on a scale in a way that is not voluntary. This example is Vegan Bray putting himself away, and this is sort of in the middle of that force versus choice continuum. He's not being forced to go back in his enclosure, but I'm not giving him as many choices as if he was out in the open, because I had carried the scale over to his enclosure door. Now, this is an example of me treating a sick snake, and she did not voluntarily come out of her enclosure. She doesn't feel well. She's tired of getting injections, so I pulled her whole humid hide out, and I had to get her out of the humid hide. And she has to have her mouth rinsed out, and then she has to have an injection. And so unfortunately, she is not voluntarily cooperating in any of these behaviors. So unfortunately, you are seeing what would be considered force-based handling here, or coercive handling on my part as a keeper. I forced her mouth open. I'm restraining her physically. I rinse her mouth out, and she didn't have a choice in that. It has to be done for her health and welfare, and she isn't trained to do these behaviors cooperatively. In other words, she isn't trained to open her mouth on cue and to hold in position. Some of the snakes are trained to do some of these other behaviors, but she's not. And then here she's getting an injection. And I'm not using a lot of physical restraint with her. I'm allowing her some escape and avoidance behavior. And as she is slowly moving away, that's when I chose to give the injection. And then I'm giving her the opportunity to go back into her humid hide, an area where she usually feels safe, although I can poison that if I repeatedly use the humid hide as a method to get her out, and then subsequently give her care that she doesn't find pleasurable. This is a second snake that is undergoing veterinary treatment at the time of this video, and I do give her the opportunity to target out of her enclosure first, but she's not wanting any part of it. This is her way of saying, no, I'm not going to come out, and I don't want to. And she's edging, which is that pacing of the wall and pushing along the wall. This is completely escape and avoidance behavior, and her saying, no, I don't want to interact with you. So unfortunately, she needed a mouth rinse and an injection, and I had to reach in, be intrusive, and forcibly remove her from her habitat. And all of this behavior you're seeing on her part is escape and avoidance behavior. She is stressed, she doesn't want this interaction, and she is trying to get away. And because she has to have this treatment, I'm having to use force. I'm having to be coercive. I'm having to forcibly remove her from her habitat and restrain her. Now, I chose to allow her to coil on that perch with the back end of her body because I thought that would make her feel somewhat more secure, and then I would have to physically restrain her less. So I force her mouth open. She spits the card out, but that's okay. I really just needed to see inside her mouth. I can open it with the syringe to rinse it out, which I did. But all of this behavior you're seeing on her part is sad for me to see, because it's anything but voluntary. It's anything but cooperative care. It's me just completely forcing this treatment on her when she doesn't want anything to do with it. And obviously I'm doing that in the least intrusive, most effective way possible. But for this particular snake, the least intrusive, most effective way possible involves a lot of coercion and a lot of force, because she just isn't willing to do anything cooperatively. And she's very young and not trained for very many cooperative behaviors at this stage in her life. So all of that with Laia and Tria and having to treat them was difficult to watch, because pretty much all of that was aversive. And I didn't want that to be the last video that you saw during this presentation. So we are going to end with a very positive and happy video of Tau Ceti voluntarily approaching me and coming out of his enclosure. This is our super dwarf reticulated python, Tau Ceti. We call him TC for short. He's from Reach Out Reptiles. And I opened his enclosure door and I presented my hand at a right angle to one of his perches. So he has the choice here to climb over my hand and keep going to the other side of his enclosure and come out of his enclosure a different way, or he could retreat back into his enclosure and hide, or he can choose to climb up my arm. And he thought about it a little bit and he decided to climb up my arm right to me. I hope that you have gotten something out of this educational program. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me through my website's contact form or via email at behavioreducationllc@gmail.com, or you can contact me via YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, please remember to always be kind, love your animals, and think least intrusive, minimally aversive, or least intrusive, most effective.